condurre questa conferenza stampa.
No.
L'augurio è questo, e lo lascio con le parole di uno dei miei scrittori preferiti, che è Gilbert Keith.
Abbiamo uscita audio alle camere?
Prego?
Non c'è audio qui.
L'augurio è questo. Chesterton diceva che gli angeli riescono a volare perché non si prendono sul serio, e io auguro a tutti noi, a cominciare da me, di essere angeli per tutti questi 10 giorni. Buona serata, buona giornata e divertitevi.
Non c'è audio.
Allora, buongiorno, benvenuti, è un piacere di presentarvi
Deve aspettare un minuto che arriva l'audio alle camere, perché sennò...
Sì. Ci dite quando possiamo, però, perché non c'è l'audio. They don't have the sound, just a few seconds more. Ci siamo?
Oh.
No. Just one second. Just one. Che facciamo? Andiamo. Allora. Ho il piacere, quindi dicevo, di presentarvi i voi Studi, Rosamund, Pike e il regista Scott Cooper. Allora, attendo le vostre domande e... Qual è il canale? 2. Allora, vorrei cominciare con una domanda, in realtà una domanda per tutti e tre. Il film ci riporta indietro al 1892, ma questa è una storia che parla anche dell'America di oggi e potrebbe essere ambientata anche in altri luoghi, non necessariamente l'America. E anche la frase che introduce il film sottolinea questo. Ecco, se volete raccontarci un po' proprio di della rilevanza nell'attualità di questa storia.
Well, the story today has become more relevant than when I was first writing the screenplay. It's no secret that America is experiencing a vast racial and cultural divide that since November has grown and is growing ever wider by the day. America has never been more polarized. You have people who live on the coasts, New York, Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Miami, these city centers where there's a great deal of interaction with people from very disparate ethnic backgrounds. But generally, in the center of the country, we have a nation that is less so. So what happens is the nation then becomes quite polarized, and since our last election, it's really come into stark relief. So this particular film, I hope, can start a conversation about inclusion and understanding the ways of others, reconciliation, and a sense of healing that's needed between two very disparate cultures. One, a cavalry captain who has been indoctrinated by the United States government to hate those who are minorities, and certainly those who are indigenous peoples, Native Americans. And then you have a group of Native American prisoners known as hostiles that have unfortunately had their private lands stolen from them, their culture taken from them. And here you have these two cultures who are forced to travel from New Mexico to Montana which is a very arduous journey, but truly a journey of the soul. And through their shared grief and their tragedy and their loss, it does become evident that they're all human. And they all experience these type of emotions together as one. So that you see by the end of the film, there has been a sense of healing and reconciliation. And if in America and the world over, who are all experiencing these types of themes, if this film can start a conversation, then I feel like I have at least played my part in that.
The question was also for you, if you want to say something about...
I feel Scott answered so comprehensively.
I simply add that I personally live in the flyover states, which Scott mentioned in terms of American culture as it stands today. And this locale is actually kind of a mirror to our indigenous existence within the USA of today. So for us, it's more or less been a continuing process of our adaptation, our ability to adapt to the kind of world that we are living in, which, as Scott mentioned, is becoming perhaps a bit more volatile in terms of race relations and societal norms. So I feel that our film does speak to the contemporary as well as the historical, and hopefully we as human beings can learn from that.
Sì, arrivo subito. Una domanda per Rosamund Pike. Vorrei chiederle di raccontarci un po' ecco, che cosa ha pensato quando le è stato proposto questo personaggio. Le donne nei western sono trattate molto spesso, sono state trattate molto spesso in maniera diversa. Qui c'è un personaggio che fa un percorso molto doloroso, però è anche una figura molto insolita in questo western, che in realtà cerca di evitare tutti gli stereotipi di questo genere. Quindi qual è stato il suo approccio al personaggio?
People have asked if I, based her on any other performance, but I felt that what Scott had written was so real. I didn't want to base her on anything other than life. I think it's interesting, people describe her as a very strong woman. I would agree. I think she goes on a massive journey. It's a very, 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 very profound story of tremendous loss, probably the most unbearable loss a human being can endure is the loss of 3 children and your husband. And I think at the point that Christian Bale's character meets Rosalie, she has no desire to live. I think she thinks that she will die where her family lay, next to her sleeping, or in fact dead children. So for me, the interesting thing was working out how someone can find a reason to live. Is it through faith? Is it through the connection with somebody else who's equally damaged? Is it through discovering that however much hatred you carry, when the perpetrator of that crime is killed, it doesn't give you any relief? You can have that hate, but of course the death of that person who committed that murder doesn't bring back your family. Rosalie's strength is not like the strong women of modern films who have to be strong because they're cut in the image of a man. They wield a sword or they wield a gun or they show masculine qualities. I think Rosalie's qualities are inherently feminine. She sees, she understands, she witnesses, she learns, and she grows. And I also feel that her purpose becomes kind of being a mother, not quite a mother, but providing a feminine counterpart to Christian's character. I feel that one of her purposes is to convey to him that he's a good man, because I think that she sees in him a man who feels his soul is very, very dark, and of course she knows that he has been the one thing that has taken her out of her complete and utter despair and hopelessness. As you see, I've lived this character, I haven't talked about her, and so to talk about her is hard, because it's a rare film for me, this one, because when I watch it, I relive it. They're not decisions I made, it's a journey I lived, and so I'm not very equipped to discuss her that eloquently.
C'era una domanda lì? Prego. Microfono qui.
Sì, grazie. Catello Masullo, parere dell'ingegnere, domanda per il regista. Naturalmente mi volevo riallacciare proprio a questa attualità importante, diciamo, di questo film, nel senso in particolare del processo di conoscenza del diverso da sé, e che in qualche modo, quando il diverso viene conosciuto, non ti fa più paura e non lo devi più combattere. E quindi è forse vero quello che Albert Einstein, la prima volta che venne nel vostro paese, negli Stati Uniti d'America, nei formi incredibili della immigration, quando c'era Arrigo Razza, lui scrisse umana.
I think that's just it. I think that we, certainly as Americans or the world over, can do a better job of understanding others. I can only speak to my experience in America, and it's extremely disheartening to see events take place in, for instance, Charlottesville, Virginia, that we witnessed a couple of months back. I happen to be from Virginia, and to see that play out, the anti-Semitism, the anti-minority, to see those violent acts play out in what is a citadel of higher learning at the University of Virginia. It's certainly for myself and for my two young children, who happen to be in the film, who play Rosamund, Pike's daughters. They only grew up with 8 years of Barack Obama, 8 years that served as a sense of hope, 8 years that we recall largely very fondly, and then to see what is now happening to America, they and I, as their father, don't quite understand. It's difficult to reconcile those 8 years with what we're now experiencing. So I think what we as Americans, and again the world over, I think it really comes down to inclusion and listening. Because if we listen to those that differ from us, that's where we can most learn. And we need to be more open to other cultures, other customs. And if this film, again, can speak to that in some way, then I am heartened. But we're on a course in America that, if it continues this way, and I'm generally a very optimistic person, but if it continues in the way that it does, then I think the difficulties of overcoming that are going to be quite vast. But we've done it before. We did it in the 1940s. Let's hope that we aren't headed that way, though.
Buongiorno, sono qui in prima fila. Buongiorno, Patrizia Simonetti, Spettacolo Mania. Una domanda per la protagonista Rosamund Pike. Pike. Volevo chiedere, nel film, nonostante abbiano sofferto entrambi, è lei che diciamo fa il percorso più velocemente, il percorso di avvicinamento, no? Verso l'altro e di tutto ciò di cui parlavamo poco fa. Si parla spesso delle donne che sono più empatiche, che sono più portate all'ascolto attivo e quindi ad avvicinarsi al diverso, e che questa rivoluzione che in molti auspichiamo, questo avvicinarsi appunto all'altro e ai popoli e alle persone diverse da noi, comincerà dalle donne. Volevo sapere, dopo aver interpretato questo personaggio che spinge ovviamente anche il protagonista a fare lo stesso cammino di avvicinamento, la pensa anche lei così? Cioè che tutto comincerà dalle donne.
We've all been riveted recently by what happens when women join together and speak out. So, I mean, I think there's with Rosalie and her story. You know, at the beginning, she displays a sort of ignorance. You know, Comanche Native Americans ambushed her and killed her family. She sees the Cheyenne family traveling with the cavalry and immediately feels fear. They are the indistinct other. She doesn't know the distinction between different tribes, different customs, you know, as big as, I suppose, between different nationalities. But then she watches, you know, she has nothing to say at that point. I mean, her grief is so acute, there's nothing to say but watch, and she sees and feels tremendous pain, I think, at seeing a mother whose son has not been killed with them. The child is there, it's very hard to look at, but she sees a mother who is like her, who would be equally devastated if that child was to go. And thank you. I suppose that it's a sort of organic. I don't think she makes a choice. I don't think it's just watching. It's like there's a moment where she knows the boy's name. She knows because she's been listening, because she's human. You know, her journey is very different from Christian Bale's character. You know, his trajectory as a soldier has needed to have an enemy. If he suddenly is told that this man is not your enemy, then what has his whole life been about? And I think that's the other political dimension of war and combat that Scott explores very deftly and interestingly in the film. Is hatred is bred in soldiers out of necessity, because they are told that their job is validated by an enemy. And I think the scene in the film where Wes and Christian have this sort of face-to-face moment of truth just before the chief dies, it really explores those themes very, very movingly and very, very powerfully. It's you know, your adversary is what you need to sustain you.
Una domanda lì?
Sì, grazie. Una domanda per Wes, in realtà. Qui. Salve. So che lei ha prestato servizio in Vietnam negli anni 60 e volevo sapere se quell'esperienza le è poi servita anche in questo film e se ha trovato magari la stessa empatia tra i personaggi e la stessa empatia che ha avuto magari con qualche civile lì.
I can say yes. Over the years, yes, I have. In fact, referring directly to that particular question about Vietnam, yes. As a matter of fact, there were times wherein Vietnamese, either our allies or who knows what they were. They would speak to me in terms of, you same Vietnamese, huh? You same Vietnamese. And that struck a chord. That struck a chord within me, wherein I began to think, yes, it's true. It hasn't been that long since this great army of American military were chasing me through the woods, chasing me over the plains, and yes, I identified very much so in terms of being in that particular political position. It's not an easy thing, but yes, I can draw from that, and have done so throughout my career, really.
Roberto Lafrigi per Tolkien. Io insisto sempre con Studi perché la domanda è sempre per lui. Noi parliamo di Ostili, l'America ha sempre avuto, anche adesso, bisogno di ostili, cioè non parliamo adesso di nemici interni ma nemici esterni, cioè se vediamo tutta la sua storia c'è sempre la ricerca disperata di un nemico, ma adesso abbiamo i nordcoreani, prima c'erano altri e così via, quindi perché c'è questa disperata ricerca, secondo lei, questo arriva anche al regista, di avere per forza un nemico, un antagonista esterno, a prescindere dai problemi di geopolitica, che poi lo sappiamo benissimo come funziona, perché questa proprio ansia di avere un nemico, una cosa che noi europei ci siamo massacrati, però poi alla fine abbiamo capito che è meglio la pace.
Yes, I would say that peace is better, but we in America have a long history of having those that we see as enemies, whether it's when the European colonists, the Spanish, the French, and the English arrived on American soil and started to take land that was not theirs from the indigenous people, Native Americans. And then we needed an enemy in the King of England when we wanted our independence. And from that, it was the Spanish, and it was the French, and it was the Vietnamese, the Russians during the Cold War, Korea in the 50s, and now, of course, it's North Korea yet again. I'm not quite sure where that comes from. I do know that we've had a few presidents in the past that do feel like they're cowboys, and they look to that Western mythology of very starkly black and white, good versus evil. I don't understand why we just can't all get along. But it all comes down to resources, right? And it comes down to imperialism. Again, I find that we are headed, and I'm generally an optimist by nature, if you can't tell from my very uplifting films, that I do believe in the best of human nature, but we certainly need it now because we are headed, I think, down a very dark and dangerous path.
I think that America needs enemies everywhere, to tell the truth, and we have many within as well, and not necessarily us as indigenous people, but people who are domestic terrorists, if you will, who probably carry out more harm and destruction within our nation than political foes from outside our borders. But yes, I think that the military-industrial complex pointed out by Dwight D. Eisenhower years and years ago points directly toward exactly the idea that America continues to need enemies because that's its economic growth, unfortunately. And I am, at this point, being a pessimist about it.
Buongiorno, Beatrice Bertuccioli del Quotidiano Nazionale, una domanda per il regista. Un western per parlare dell'oggi, ma comunque un western, e quindi volevo chiederle il suo rapporto con questo genere intramontabile del cinema americano, ma non solo americano, insomma, quali suggestioni ha sempre esercitato su di lei e cosa pensa della stagione che questo genere ha vissuto anche in Italia con lo spaghetti western. Grazie.
Yes, and that, westerns never really seem to go out of fashion in America. And of course, I love Leone. Again, I think it's a little bit of what I touched on a moment ago about these very stark good and evil characters, very black and white, men and women who live by a code, the majesty of the American West, the sense of yearning for something better, the manifest destiny. And it's also to what the gentleman just spoke of, always having a foe, an enemy that you can overcome. And unfortunately in the Western it's always been the Native Americans who from classic cinema have been portrayed, in my estimation, quite negatively. But this film, for me, is really a Western only in era and locale. I hope, my intention was for the film to be a humanistic endeavor that crosses the genre borders and really illuminates the human experience in a way that understands grief and loss, tragedy, healing, all those sort of things that sometimes we don't often see in American Westerns of yesteryear. Although there are a few shots in the film that I did pay homage to John Ford's The Searchers. But the movie also is equally influenced by the work of the American author Cormac McCarthy, or the photographer Edward Curtis, or even musical pieces that often inspire me. So, you know, as a filmmaker, you try to take this big stew of influences that you've had ever since your youth, and if you deign to tell personal stories, somehow they will wend their way into the narrative.
Bene, era l'ultima domanda, allora thank you so much. This is special. No, but this is what they... Ok, allora vieni e grazie a tutti, thank you so much. Thank you.